before I was born, there's a certain kind of demagoguery to the Christian church, especially in more remote parts of Jamaica, that a lot of pastors are fan of authorities, and you see that a lot in evangelical churches. You see it here. You certainly see it in the States, where a pastor will know of horrendous things people have done. But
in the community?
In the community. But because they consider themselves a fan of authority, they think, it's dealt with. It's like, it's the case of like Josh Duggar in the States, who has been molesting his own sisters. But as far as they're concerned, the pastor says, hey, I forgave him.
Right.
And there was a lot of that, and still a lot of that in Jamaica. This church being the final authority. And the problem with it as well is because they're the final authority, they can justify a lot of terrible things. So people will beat and kill gay people because, well, the church is kind of cool with it.
But were you, I mean, when you were a young man, were you part of a church?
I was involved, I mean, not even up to fairly recently. I was deeply involved in church. I was a church exorcist.
So if anybody needs exorcism, then you can...
it's one of my skills. I can drive demons from you. Hey, you got to find work where you find work,
But did you, I mean, because one of the things I was thinking is that there's a similar colonial legacy of anti-gay legislation in India as to in Jamaica, but the difference in India, where you've had decriminalization and then recriminalization and probably a change back to decriminalization, you don't really have the religious undertone, whereas presumably in Jamaica, there's the Christian rules against the idea that somebody could be born gay.
Yeah, and it's a lot of it, you never know with Jamaica where it is sort of the Victorianism ends and the Christianity begins. Because a lot of that law, it's not Christian, it's just Victorian.
Yes.
And sometimes we'll clutch the Bible, saying the Bible says so. But I'm like, yeah, but you had shrimp only last night. Should I put you to death?
Oh, meaning that shrimp is banned by what, the book of...
I think that's in Leviticus.
In Leviticus, exactly. You can't eat seafood.
And you're going to have to show me some proof you were a virgin when you got married, or I'm putting you to death right now.
So the world that you wrote about in the book of Night Women, your second novel, that was in a way catching that Victorian era, or maybe a little before the Victorian era. It's quite a frightening book because of the way that the plantation slavery is so sort of all-encompassing.
Right.
One thing you do there, which is quite similar to A Brief History of Seven Killings, is that you inhabit the voice or the mind of a character, particularly with Lilith. I mean, with that book, how did you get so far back? Were you going to historical texts in order to figure out the language, or were you inventing the language?
Sort of a combination of both. Nobody from the UK, no British person, no slave master would have been interested in preserving slave language. African dad. It wouldn't have. I mean, that it survived. It's just sort of the indomitable spirit of Africans who came to the Caribbean, and a lot of it because they tried very hard to stamp it out.
Right.
And I think in Jamaica it was actually stamped out a lot more effectively than say Cuba or Haiti. So there was some guesswork. A lot of it is just me imagining what would this Pride and Prejudice chapter look like in total patois.
Sure.
So some of it was guesswork. Some of it I think is just what survived. But a huge part of slavery was this sort of cultural erasure, and to the extent we still one of the lasting effects we still have with it, and this comes back to the language of the book, is this obsession. I know we Jamaicans sometimes have, maybe not so much anymore, of becoming even more British than the British. And the idea of proper speech and so on, and being sort of raised to be subservient to an empire that doesn't even exist.
So I mean, just to explain in a Indian context, when you say patois, you're talking about a language which originated out of various languages, of which English was the main one. Is that
English was English was the main one, and there's a great poet, Mervyn Morris, who has a book called "Is English We Speaking?"
right?
And yeah, English was the main one, but there is so much fun, there's so much Fulani, there is so much Twi in patois.
Yeah.
But there is always, and there still is, this idea that it's inferior language. And one of the big struggles I had with this novel was just the language. In fact, it didn't start out that way. It actually did start out as a Jane Austen
Right.
kind of novel. It was very proper and well spoken while they whipped black people. But and I just ran into a dead end because that was just not the voice that I wanted to use to tell the story. And it was a big struggle. I fought with that book the whole way. I
Right.
fought with that character, Lilith, the whole way.
Yeah.
She's not even supposed to be a character in the book.
Right.
She showed up one day as a woman in the corner of some room. And I was like, you know what? I'll just write a chapter on her and see what happens. And a chapter turned into 660 pages. And she took over the book. And I actually was pretty upset about it.
So to move on to the book that won the Booker, A Brief History of Seven Killings. Just before we talk about the book itself, I mean, there's the sort of background theme or thread, which is the attempted murder of Bob Marley and
Right.
the people who were involved in that murder, attempted murder. I mean, one of the odd things about Bob Marley is that he has become so mainstream. You go to a shopping center in any country in the world and he'll be there as Muzak and it'll be Three Little Birds. Or
And
yet at the same time, he's a sort of figure of resistance and glamour. I mean, you don't name him. You keep him as a sort of overhang. Why is he there? What's his function in the book?
That's a good question because he was one of the later ideas that happened in this book. The very first page that I wrote in this novel is now page 458.
Right.
Which gives an idea of how crazy the genesis of this book was. And Marley just sort of emerged as this thing binding everything together. Because I really didn't start writing this novel in a linear way. I didn't start with the beginning and got to the ending. As I said, literally started with the middle of the book.
Right.
Then went back ways and then continued. And Marley just emerged as this sort of connective tissue, even though I did have a character who tried to kill him from pretty early on. And because the book is pretty much, you could divide it into pre-death and post-death of Marley. And as soon as Marley dies, everything holding not just the people who tried to kill him, but the whole country kind of frays in a way. And to the point where quite a few of these characters end up in America.
Okay, let's come on to that because what you did in the Book of Night Women is you got the voice or the imagined voice of 200 years ago. I mean, here you set yourself an exceptionally difficult task because you have multiple narrators. You have figures who pop up and reappear, get killed. There are men, there are women, and perhaps most complicated of all, you're spanning several decades, and you've got to make sure that the language that each person is speaking in is applicable to 1975
Right.
or Miami 15 years, 20 years later, or New York in 1991. Again, did you have to figure out the dictionary, the encyclopedia, the language?
I actually wrote a dictionary.
Like Dr. Johnson?
Yeah, I actually had to create my own dictionary.
Okay.
And my 80s dictionary is different from my 70s dictionary.
I think this should be published, the collected dictionaries of Marlon James.
Because and not just that, a 40-year-old from 1979 is not going to sound like a 25-year-old from 1979. You have to know what decade would something be ace and what decade would something be gnarly. And so a lot of the research in this book, a lot of the big events in this novel I already knew. Smaller things like what was the #1 song in 1979 or so on. And a lot of that I had to research. So yeah, I had to build these sort of voices. But to me, it was a lot of work, but it also was the most fun part about a novel, just differentiating voices, especially when you get to characters who are actually quite similar. What is it about them? And a lot of that is, some of that boiled down to, well, this person is more verbose than the other person, or this person thinks he speaks proper English, but he doesn't.
Right.
And just sort of building these characters that way.
So, I mean, for example, you have Alex Pierce, who's a rather annoying American Rolling Stone journalist. And
he doesn't know he's actually not a good writer.
he doesn't know he's not good. And he says to his editor, hey, on the phone, hey boss, please listen to me. I'm sitting on something big here, really big. Square biz, man. And the editor says, quit with the fucking jive talk, Pierce. You're from Minnesota. Now, Marlon, you're from Minnesota as well as Jamaica.
Yeah.
Do you feel part of Minnesota? Is that very much your home now?
It is kind of very much my home. You know, the thing is, this is my big dilemma with Minnesota. I have no problem losing my Jamaican accent. I just don't want to lose it to a Minnesotan one. I love you, Minnesota. I know you're going to see this.
But I think you're still sounding more Jamaica than Minnesota.
Huh?
You're still sounding more Jamaica.
Yeah, but that's just stuff like water now.
Oh, you do?
Yeah, like water.
How should you say it?
And then people here go, what are you talking about? I got water. It's
Water?
like, yeah, water. It's like, it's destroying my, I have nothing unique about me anymore.
You have all these voices. The writer, Colin Channa, he described what you were doing as being something like, for literature, what Lee Scratch Perry did for music. And there are soundtracks pretty much threaded through the entire book. I mean, the book is music really all the way. Was that conscious, or was it simply that you were listening to particular music, or that you identified the music with the decade, or?
Pretty much all of the above.
All of the above, okay.
I write to music. I can't write in silence. Which is not necessarily that the music that appears in the book is the music I was listening to when I was writing.
Right.
For example, I listened to a lot of German rock.
You did?
Yeah.
I imagined you were listening to the Scatolites and Black Uhuru and
I was listening
all
to
these
German
people
rock. I was listening to Adam and the Ants.
Oh.
I was listening to MIA. I was listening to pretty much anything. I can't write. I wrote my second novel when I was on tour for my first, so I had to become accustomed to noise.
Right.
Because people are not going to shut up in Starbucks because I want to write the great Jamaican novel. They don't care. So I was writing a lot of music, but also that so much of the novel is transported by that. It's Jamaica is a very musical culture. Usually the way I remember, even now, the way I remember decades, remember past, is what song was I listening to, at the time, and music comes in and comes out in all sorts of ways in Jamaica. One of the things that surprised a lot of foreigners when they came to Jamaica is how little Jamaican music was playing on the radio.
Right.
Some people say, when you growing up, did you hear Bob Marley all the time? I'm like, actually, no, not until he died, and everybody played him out of guilt. It's like, it really, that's not where you went to hear Jamaican music.
Yeah, I remember being struck in Jamaica by the way that you'd have people who just drive along and then sort of stop at a crossroads and put down a sound system and they start to play.
And they just start to play. It's one of the things that, the only place I see that is New Orleans. Where, I know you were trying to get to this place, but we're going to put a disco right here, right now. Yeah. You can dance or you can quarrel, but we're not moving. And I think it's just part of it is, this sort of, everything kind of moves to a rhythm in Jamaica. And that also is a huge influence. The other way in which music was a big influence on me is in a lot of ways, this is not a hard and fast absolute, but in a lot of ways, musicians were the first people, certainly one of the first set of people, certainly in a popular medium, to use the Jamaican patois, the Jamaican dialect, as a voice of saying really serious things. I mean, there are people who are saying very sly things and very sort of tongue-in-cheek things like Louise Bennett, But the idea that I could just speak the patois in my head and talk about complicated things and sad things, that was really one of the things that the musicians were doing first. And that was a huge influence.
You're talking about musicians of what, the 1950s?
In the 70s.
Oh,
It was in the
later,
70s, like the reggae musicians.
Oh, I see.
Not just Bob Marley and Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, but you Roy and a whole bunch of Jamaican songwriters, singers who were using the idea that the voice that's coming out of my mouth can be the voice for telling any form of literature is something that we're just not raised that way. We were still raised. I grew up thinking Dickens was a contemporary author.
Well, I get, Dickens, he'd do the police in different voices.
He did. He was also a horrendous racist, but we all have our flaws, I guess.
Do you, so when you said just now the idea of the great Jamaican novel, I mean, one of the things that is astonishing about this book is that it is exceptionally self-confident. It's deliberately epic in scope. There's a lot of risk-taking in it. What was that? Was that coming out of what you'd written before?
It's funny, because I wasn't self-confident at all.
Right.
Writing it.
But you just said the great Jamaican novel.
Oh God, I hate that term, the great anything novel.
Ah.
I always think it's the great, I think it's always, when I hear the great American novel, I think, you mean the great American neurosis. There is and there can never be such a thing.
But it's certainly not a quiet ambition.
No, it's not.
You're taking on decades of Jamaican history.
But I was scared the whole time writing it. It's just that being afraid doesn't stop me from doing it. But I was afraid of afraid of all the risks I was taking, and there are certain things that I can write it, but I just like this will never fly. And the only way I got through certain parts of this book, including the whole idea of taking everybody, throwing them, and just dumping them in America, was I got to the point where I just said, you know what, I'll leave it there until my editor takes it out. Which is now my rule with everything I write. I'll just leave it until he takes it out.
So before you actually moved to America, was America a big aspect of your cultural life? Or was it Jamaica focused, or was it the British post-colonial legacy, or what was the...
I think by the time, my generation came about, the British colonial legacy was pretty much dead. It's, I'm not, and that's the thing, I'm not in dialogue with the UK. And I wasn't raised that way. My parents, yeah.
Right.
But by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, I was being raised by Sesame Street. And listening to disco. And even in a more creepy way, if the police another way, that a lot of this sort of American propaganda machine was already working.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, there's a scene in the book where Josie Wales gets this coloring book called Democracies for Us.
Okay.
And I tell everybody the craziest parts of my book those are actually the true parts. The normal parts are made up.
You mean like the moment when the gangsters are reading Bertrand Russell?
Oh, that actually happened. There's actually Bertrand Russell in the Jamaica Penitentiary Library.
Okay.
And when I heard it, I'm like, this has to be
So
my
these
book.
are kind of autodidact gangsters who are reading...
It's ridiculous. They were reading autobiography of Malcolm X and the problems of philosophy.
Okay.
I think it's fantastic. But the coloring, there was actually a coloring book that was distributed to children, saying, this is a side of the world in a democracy, and this is a side of the world in communism. And you print the democracy side had rainbows, and you get to use all your Crayola markers. And the drab communism side, you just get to use black and gray and so on.
A little red?
Maybe some red. Lots of red. But I remember getting that book. That's an absolutely ridiculous thing. But again, it's one of the true things in a novel.
Yeah. So your parents were both in the Jamaican Constabulary Force. Your mum was a cop and your dad was a judge. So the sort of expectation when you wrote the book was that your ghetto knowledge was authentic. But it wasn't?
Well, No, you know what? Listen, the first time I heard a live gunshot was during a Martin McDonough play on
Okay.
stage. And I have no intentions of hearing another one. It's, no, I grew up very middle class. If you read Carl Nosgard's book, My Struggle, book one, I pretty much had the very same childhood. You basically were bored. You're trying to impress people older than you.
Yeah.
You're wearing alternative rock T-shirts, and your family has 2 cars, but you're being raised by a TV dinner and whatever. And yeah, but I remember somebody asked me. It was on a panel actually, and Roxanne Gay was on it. And usually there's this huge disappointment when I can't tell them of the many gangsters I know. I don't, and the gunshot wound I must have somewhere near my butt or somewhere, and they're so disappointed. And the question then comes, but then by what authority are you telling these stories?
Yeah.
I'm like, you mean talent and imagination? it's I think there's this idea that if you're a writer of color, or a writer in the diaspora or whatever, that talent and imagination isn't open to you. You must have been a journalist or a witness.
Right.
And I said, no, I don't. I can't help you if you want to know all the rough and tough elements of Kingston.
But I mean, is the element of violence that is very strong and very graphic in your work?
Yeah.
I mean, is that an aesthetic, or is it coming out of saying, well, that's what the world is like?
I don't think it's an aesthetic. It's funny. And I was just coming from a panel where I was arguing against aesthetics in violence when we were talking about violence. So my childhood, my upbringing was pretty stable, almost to the point of boredom. The thing about Jamaica, though, is I don't think you have to see I don't think you have to see bloodshed to be affected by it.
Yeah.
And I don't think you have to see violence or experience it to be affected by it. A lot of what I know about violence, for example, my personal experience is the fear of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that it might not happen, but it might.
It's threat.
And
yeah.
sometimes that
And in
uncertainty
fact, you use
is
that a lot
worse.
with your characters, don't you?
Yeah.
The idea of the threat of rape, the threat of violence or murder,
Right.
being as strong as the actual act of violence.
Yeah, and that's when people said to me, you've written a very violent novel. I'm like, you sure it's that violent? Or is the threat there's a lot of threat of violence happening. And I think that is very real.
How far would you link that to the legacy of what you write about in the book of Night Women?
Oh, I'll link it very closely.
Can you just, for a sort of
Because
non-Caribbean audience, explain that?
because a lot of Jamaica, a lot of the ways in which we enforce law and order in Jamaica is linked with oppressing the majority of the population.
Yeah.
The Jamaican police force came out of not necessarily a desire for law and order, but to suppress and brutally suppress the local population, and that legacy lives on. It lives on in the violence, it lives on in the corruption, it lives on in the fact that most confessions still happen through torture.
Right.
So it happens through duress. There's no investigation going on. I just basically beat you until you say, yes, I shot that person, or yes, I raped that person. And then it goes to court.
Yeah.
And that comes out of not just slavery, but Crown Colony. In fact, Crown Colony is what it came out of, really. Which was of course worse. And we were a Crown Colony all the way up to independence.
So in fact, if you look at the spectrum of sort of British colonial rule, Crown Colony tended to be the most violent.
It was the most violent.
Yeah.
It was the most, again, Dickens was a big supporter of that.
Right.
He was all for Crown Colony. I mean, on the Crown Colony, hundreds of people were just executed for, in Moran Bay, and this was 30 years after slavery. So that kind of order through the expression of extreme violence was not going to vanish. So it lives on, and it carries on. It carried straight into the 20th and 21st century.
Do you? I mean, one of the consequences of, well, I mean, maybe any kind of success, but particularly literary success, is that you instantly are expected to be a commentator, a figure of wisdom, and somebody who can pronounce on all sorts of issues. I mean, I might be wrong, but I got the impression that you've segged into that without too much trouble. I mean, you seem to be very relaxed about speaking about larger questions, things which I guess you've thought about and you're now being asked about?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I can't speak for every writer, but I think as a writer, you do have to pay attention to the world outside your window. Especially since I actually don't write about the world outside my window. I tend to, I mean, this is the closest I come to a contemporary novel and set 40 years ago. But I you know, and not that I'm necessarily, I'd call myself an activist. I just, you know, I've always, you know, I come from two parents who have never had problems speaking their minds. You know, my mother's the type of person who would tell their children, you know, don't get me a present because you're going to buy something cheap and I don't want cheap stuff in my house. I love you. So yeah, and you know, I'm used to doing that. I'm used to just sort of talking about what's out there. And I know, well, one thing that happened post-Booker is that a lot of people pay attention to it.
Absolutely.
It's like, I will just say something crazy on Facebook and it's a headline in The Guardian. I'm like, oops. There I go again.
Or you said, for example, that if the bear in Revenant had been a polar bear, it might have been white enough to be up for an Oscar.
Yeah, I couldn't resist that. And then I saw Comedy Channel put it up. It was, you know, because we're talking about the exclusion of any people of color in the Academy, and you know, and I just read, and the hashtag is Oscars so white. So I just wrote Oscars so white that the bear in the Revenant would have been nominated if it were polar.
Yeah.
And then it got copied everywhere.
But you know, you've been living in America through the Obama presidency, and I remember when we met back in whenever it was quite soon after Obama had been elected, and I remember this was at another literary festival, the Calabash Literary Festival, and I remember somebody on stage who I guess was a singer saying to the audience, "The president become the black president," and repeating this to the crowd who were feeling a sense of, my God, Obama has been elected. And now we're whatever, 7, 8 years on. There's this feeling of, well, you've got Ferguson, you've got all sorts of tensions that quite clearly have not gone away but have maybe got worse. You've got children being shot because they're carrying Skittles or a toy gun or whatever. I mean, living in America, do you feel that things have changed and become better? Do you think that things are discussed at least in a way that indicates progress?
I don't know. I don't think things have gotten better at all. I think more people are becoming aware that it's bad, and it's always been bad. And I think that I'm a big supporter of Black Lives Matter, and I think a big part of the problem is convincing America that there is a problem. I know a lot of Americans who never once doubted that there were problems with the justice system until this TV show Making a Murderer appeared on Netflix last week. And they're like, oh my God, the system is so broken. I'm like, tell me more. It's like, no, you don't say. Welcome to my past 60 years. So I think there's because I think we still have this really ridiculous idea about racism, and I think we continue to look at racism as this moral failure. We continue to look at this racism as a maliciousness. Like racism is malicious. Racism isn't malicious. Racism is systemic. There are quite wonderful people out there who are oppressing other people. It's the one thing I like about the To Kill a Mockingbird sequel. It's maybe the book shouldn't have come out, but the idea that Atticus didn't become a racist in this novel, he was a racist all along. Is something that a lot of Americans have decided, I simply will not accept that. But I said that's exactly what it is. The average, racism isn't just sort of this bucktooth inbred redneck who, when he's not committing incest, is killing black people. Sometimes it's the perfectly rational person who doesn't realize that you can't say, when you say things like "you people," and that you can be a perfectly rational, normal, wonderful person, but have no problem benefiting from a system that oppresses everybody else. And I think that is just the hardest thing for Americans to understand.
And that is something specifically coming out of America, or you're saying that's a phenomenon that is the same in somewhere like the UK?
I think it's phenomenal. I think it's everywhere. You know, I went to the UK and somebody asked me, "What do you think about London?" I'm like, "Oh my God, I love the UK. Your racism is so cute here." It's it's different in the other in other territories. I think the one thing I will give America is that they're having the biggest discussions about it, and a lot of people say, "Well, at least they're talking." I don't know if that's
meaning
happening
what?
anywhere
Whereas
else.
in Britain, there's not that discussion.
There is not a
That public
discussion. There's not. And it's not just Britain that needs to have it. Italy needs to have it.
Belgium.
Belgium needs to have it. Russia needs to have it. Yeah.
Just tell me when you're being sort of written about or reacted to in a specifically Jamaican context, is there a feeling that this guy went to another country, he had his success abroad, or is it seen as a localized thing that's now become universal?
I think it's both.
Right.
It's I wrote this novel abroad.
Yeah.
But my entire literary sensibility was shaped in Jamaica. I think sometimes I'll come across reporters, intellectuals, whoever, who simply assume that I went to good old America and learned to read or something. Or, did you go to college in America? I'm like, no. Wow, you know a lot about literature. Did you read those books in America? I'm like, do you know which country you're talking about? It's like, no. I think the reason why I think it's both is that my sensibilities as a writer were already fully formed before I left.
This was after UE, University of the West Indies?
After University of the West Indies,
Yeah, okay.
working in Jamaica, living in Jamaica. I didn't leave Jamaica till I was 35.
Right, I see. Yeah.
So by then I was already damaged. I was already broken and good. There was nothing left to learn. That's not true. There's always stuff left to learn. But
what made you go to America?
primarily, just wanted a job. Primarily.
So you started teaching
I
creative
started
writing,
teaching
which you
creative
still do.
writing, yeah, which I still do.
Yeah.
It's one university for the whole Caribbean. I remember asking the chair of the English department, who's like a really good friend of mine. I was like, what would it take for me to teach here? She says, well, two things need to happen. One of us has to die, or you become too big a writer to ignore.
Was it the latter or what?
Well, by the time one of them died, I was already in the stage. So.
And do you intend to go on teaching creative writing? Do you feel that it is something that changes the way people write?
I do think it changes the way people write. Granted, I teach undergrads. I teach really young writers, and there are lots of reasons why I want to keep teaching. One, I love being surrounded by people who are just creating for creating's sake, because I haven't done that in decades.
Yeah.
I create to pick up a check. I don't care. But the other thing is, I certainly open myself up to learn from students, and I learned some pretty profound things from my students. I remember a student coming into my office, and she was crying. He was crying, as a transgender student, and I said, what? Other than being profoundly disturbed that a student is crying in my office, what's going on? And he said, you know, if it's one thing I am so sick and tired of, I run into it in every class, and everybody's cool with it. I see it on TV, everywhere I run into it. I'm sick and tired of people linking mental illness to criminality. Why is the killer always schizophrenic? Why is the rapist always psycho? As a mentally ill person, I am sick and tired of being the villain in everybody's story when all we are trying to do is just live. And that shook me in my chair, because I was one of the people doing that too.
You were doing that in your fiction?
I don't think I was doing it in my fiction, but I was perfectly fine with other people doing it.
Yeah.
I like Silence of the Lambs as much as everybody else. Right. I watch Criminal Minds and so on, but it never occurred to me that the typical schizophrenic person is not out there killing people. Is your perfectly normal son-in-law who's doing it? Is your perfectly normal kid who's raping people? It's, but it never occurred to me, and that was a profound lesson. Now I say that to my students, there are certain stories I will not tolerate in this class.
Right.
So if you have it where the schizophrenic, psychopathic person just kills somebody, I will not be reading that story. Because you're gonna have to come better with they must have been insane. I was like, I know lots of people struggling with mental illness.
Right.
They're not the ones I'm worried about. And yeah, and so I don't want to miss the opportunity of learning something like that again. And that's something you're only going to pick up in a classroom.
Sure.
If your students feel free to share those things with you.
Tell me before we take audience questions and interactions, something you mentioned maybe about a year ago was your interest in the Great Zimbabwe and the idea of potentially writing about that past civilization. Can you just say a little about that?
Well, I don't want to say too much and jinx it. I already began writing it.
Oh, you began writing it?
I began writing it. I was telling, I was talking to, I think it was on Charlie Rose several weeks ago. How I just got sick and tired of arguing for a black hobbit. If Lord of the Rings was more diverse, nobody would have cared. They would have just moved on.
Right.
And in the middle, and the person was arguing, and the person said, Lord of the Rings was based on British mythology. It's Celtic, it's Norse. And I'm like,
Norse mythology.
Yeah, I was like, Lord of the Rings isn't real. It's like when people say Santa Claus is white. Santa isn't real. You can do whatever you want with it. And then I just say, you know what? Keep your damn hobbit. You want your elf, take your elf. Take it and kick your own backside out. With that, I also simultaneously recognized, discovered that African history, African folklore, African religions, and is as rich and varied and astonishing and maddening as any other mythology. And I said, you know what? I'm going to write a novel pulling from that.
So you started work on it?
Yeah, I've started working on it. It's sort of for want of a better term, an African fantasy novel.
Right.
Based on African race. Europeans are only mentioned once in the whole book. And hey, sneak preview. It's a character says, I've heard of these people beyond the sea. Every 7 days they eat their own god. So everybody reacts in disgust.
Yeah, that'll go down well in Jamaica.
Every 7 days they eat their own god. That's the only mention of Europeans.
Right.
And it's not that I'm trying to write a historical novel, because I'm not.
Yeah.
I just really want to play around in a different playground, really. Yeah. And that's certainly what I'm doing next. And
so you've started that book. How far have you got?
Oh, I've only written like 10 pages.
That's enough. That's enough. You're there. Okay, let's take some interactions from the